Hi, everyone. Welcome to Accessibility Talks. Accessibility Talks is a monthly virtual meetup where we come together to discuss topics around all things website accessibility. Each month, we have a different speaker, and they'll present an in-depth accessibility topic to the group. And then hopefully we'll have facilitate some discussion afterwards. So if you have any questions for our speaker, please post them in the chat window or tag them on Twitter with the hashtag A11yTalks, A11yTalks. If you're watching this on YouTube, then you can still participate in the discussion. It'll just have to be on Twitter or some other social media outlet. I'm your host, Carrie Fisher, and this month we have Nicolas Steenhout. He's joining us to talk about accessibility. Don't turn off that JavaScript just yet. So a little intro about Nicolas. Basically, he's amazing. He's been involved with accessibility. That's all I have to say, right? No, he's been involved with accessibility for over 20 years, so he is an expert in WCAG and Section 508 and ARIA, and he also has familiarity with a wide range of assistive technologies. He's also bilingual in English and French, and Twitter sometimes will mess up his translations. And he's also part of the new podcast called ARIA Roles, where he interviews and chats with people in the web accessibility community, and I'm hoping he can talk to us a little bit about that as well. So I've been following him on Twitter for a little bit now, but I've never had the opportunity to hear him speak at a conference until today. So I'm very excited to have him with us today. So welcome, Nicolas.
Thanks, Carrie. I appreciate the invite, and hopefully it'll be quite a bit of fun. So maybe I'll start sharing my screen and go ahead with the presentation. So bear with me for a second. Share screen. That's the one we want. And right. So what if I told you, people, that these stairs are accessible? The first reaction is, well, they're not accessible, but in fact they are. They're not accessible for wheelchairs, but in terms of accessible stairs, these are pretty good. There's a good solid handrail that is easy to follow, and it doesn't stop at the landing. So someone who needs the handrail will be able to follow, but someone who has a vision impairment will not suddenly lose the path of the stairs. There's quite visible difference in step markers, so you can actually see the difference in the step. The risers are not too high, so it's not making difficult to step up, and your foot can't actually slide through the steps. So it's a series of small details like that that make these stairs accessible. And when we talk about JavaScript, it's a little bit the same thing. JavaScript can be quite accessible or not accessible at all, depending on the need of the individual. So today we are talking about don't turn off that JavaScript just yet. It's something that's interesting because, as I'll speak a little bit more in a moment, it is something that for years and years and years we were hearing about. You can't have an accessible site with JavaScript. The fact is that we can have accessible sites using JavaScript, and we can even use JavaScript to increase accessibility. So who am I? I'm Nick Steenhout. As Carrie was saying, I've done accessibility for a very long time now. I started before there were really much talk about accessibility, and I certainly invite you to listen to the podcast where I discuss with people about the accessibility community, about the challenges we face, about where we're heading, and all that. So it's quite interesting. Now, A11y, accessibility, ally, depending on how you pronounce it. What is it? What does it do? In French, we say, qu'est-ce que ça mange en hiver? What does it eat in winter? Some of us are familiar with it, so I'm not going to spend too much time, but some of us are not so familiar with it. We may have developers that want to know a little bit more about it. So accessibility is really for everyone. It's about people who have vision impairments, but that's not just people who are blind. It could be people that have low vision. It could be my 95-year-old grandmother who wants to read her newspaper on an iPad. It's for people that have hearing impairments. It's for people that have cognitive disabilities. It's for people that are wheelchair users, whether they're paralyzed or have motor impairments. So it's a whole range. But it's important to think it's also for people that don't have a disability. So when we're writing text that's easy to read for someone that has a cognitive impairment, we have to remember it's going to be really good and beneficial for people that are non-native English speakers. If we're making sites that have really good color contrast, it's going to make a big difference to you when you're trying to look at a site on your mobile in bright sunlight outside. So there's very many similarities between accessibility needs for people with disabilities and plain usability for everybody. We're talking about making sure that our sites and our apps work on every device, whether it's a mobile phone, a tablet, or computer. So there's all kinds of different devices and range we can use. One of the things I talk about during the presentation is assistive technology. What are assistive technologies? Well, it's basically technology that helps people interact with computers, with mobile devices. So we're talking about screen readers, software that actually does, as the name implies, it reads what's on the screen, but it also allows you to interact with the computer, starting applications, starting opening files, closing files, saving files, editing, all these kind of things that are important. We're talking about people that are using the keyboard. The keyboard is an assistive technology, and the fun thing about keyboard is it was invented in the 1850s by someone who wanted to help people who were deaf write faster. And since then, we've had something like 55, 56 different iterations to reach where we're at the moment. So it's quite interesting to think about that. We have things like Dragon Naturally Speaking, which is a speech recognition. So it allows you to talk and it types, but it's more than that. It allows you to control and command your computer as well. We have sip and puff switches. So it's like a straw, and depending on how you sip in it or puff in the switch, it will allow you to navigate the web. It can also allow you to control your wheelchair, power wheelchair, and go in different directions. And I actually know someone who crossed the Atlantic solo in a sailboat. She's paralyzed from the neck down, and she used sip and puff to control her sailboat, which I thought was quite impressive. We have eye tracking software. So there's a camera that basically looks at you where you're looking at the screen, and depending on where you look and whether you blink and how you use your eyes will allow you to interact with the computer. And the list goes on. There's a lot of very different assistive technologies out there, which is one of the reasons sometimes accessibility can be quite difficult. But it's also one of the reasons why it's so important, because there's so many different people out there that have barriers if we don't build with care. So people with disabilities are by far the largest minority group on the web. If we're thinking about the Western world, we're talking in general between 15 and 20% of people with disabilities. Just incidentally, I see chat things coming up, but I don't actually see the chat. So Carrie, if you have something for me, just make sure to tell me and I'll interrupt myself.
Okay, I will. I was just reminding people to post onto the chat channel or on the hashtag A11yTalks.
Wonderful, thank you. So yeah, we have on average 1 in 5 person with disabilities that have accessibility needs. So that's quite significant, 1 in 5. We're talking about often, the sighted keyboard-only user, and some people say that that user is a myth. It doesn't exist, and I'm going to tell you, I'm not a myth at all. We're looking at people with temporary impairments having accessibility needs. On that photo is me last year after I broke both my thumbs. I had both my thumbs in casts, and obviously I was not able to use a mouse, not able to use a trackpad. I was not even able to use a keyboard modifier like the shift key. So I used a really neat feature called sticky keys, which allowed me to hit the shift key, and then I was able to use whichever key. But there are people out there that have this need, and it may not be a permanent disability. It may be a temporary impairment, or it may be just a situational thing. If you're a new mother juggling a 2-month-old baby in one hand and your cell phone in the other, trying to access information about, oh my God, what do I do now with this situation? You'll be glad for being able to have a site that was designed to be easily usable. So there's a lot to consider in terms of not just disability, but situation and temporary impairment. And I will stop talking about that because I think I'm preaching to the choir. I hear very often that accessibility is really difficult, or that you have to learn a whole new set of skills, or whatever negative things we hear about accessibility. And the one thing I remind people is, the one thing I remind coders, developers, is that I have yet to meet a developer who doesn't like a coding challenge. And accessibility is just that. It's a technical challenge. It's so instead of thinking about how difficult, what a chore it is to make accessibility happen, think of it in terms of, hey, this is actually a good puzzle. Let me see if I can build my skills and make it happen. And one of the things that we use to make sure a site is accessible is that we should be coding to requirements. The tricky things with requirements is that they don't always ensure accessibility. Now, if you can see the photo that is on the screen right now, you'll see it's a curb cut that is actually really well done. It's not too steep. There's a texture grid at the bottom, so someone using a cane will know that there's a curb cut or that the street happens. It's wide enough to use in a wheelchair, but it leads nowhere. It leads, in fact, to no sidewalk. It leads straight into a big power pole. So even if they were to put a sidewalk at the end of that curb cut, you couldn't use it. Yet the curb cut respects all requirements. It does not ensure accessibility. And we have to keep that in mind. That's why when we build things, I will say involve real users with disabilities in your testing process. That will really help make a difference in terms of, well, I think this is accessible, to somebody confirming for me that what I thought was correct or wrong, as the case may be. Now, I mentioned really briefly earlier that barriers aren't just for people with disabilities. And I have to say that JavaScript can be a problem for other people other than assistive technology users. There's some people that are still using very old browsers out there. I'm thinking of large segments of India that are still using very old versions of Internet Explorer. So we have to consider that. Some phones are problematic. Some companies use strong security. I actually was speaking to someone late last year, and they told me that their IT department decided that because there was security issues with JavaScript, they just blocked JavaScript at the firewall. So nobody using the internet from within that network was able to get access to JavaScript. So yes, we can use JavaScript to improve accessibility, but we always should keep in mind that we should use JavaScript carefully and not rely on it for delivering content. We should do progressive enhancement to make sure that things work. Right, so JavaScript. We've looked at the background, and let's look specifically at what it is. In the good old days, JavaScript broke accessibility. It was really tricky, and in fact, WCAG 1, if you are old enough to remember that, said just don't use scripting and provide a no script alternative, which is fine, but we have moved on from there. We are not at a time anymore where we can test a website for accessibility, turn off JavaScript and say, hey, the site doesn't work without JavaScript, the site is not accessible, we're going to forget about it. Excuse me for a second. Sorry about that. So in 2014, WebAIM reported the results of their screen reader survey and told us that 97% of screen reader users were, quote, JavaScript enabled, unquote. So that means that the vast majority of people that have screen readers are actually able to access the functions provided by JavaScript. We should not dismiss that. Incidentally, the WebAIM survey is still going on for a few more days this year, so I really strongly invite screen reader users to go and complete that. It's super helpful for those working at improving accessibility. What are some of the things we can use JavaScript to increase accessibility? Well, we can provide additional information. We can make sure that there's warnings and the warnings are seen easily. We're able to provide additional instructions. We're able to provide additional time for people. We're able to warn people when there's a timed response and it's running out of time. We can use a pop-up and warn people saying, hey, you're about to time out. Do you want more time? We can use JavaScript in all kinds of ways, but it needs to be perceivable. One of the things that assistive technologies, and in particular screen readers, do is that they provide information, but they basically rely on text. It's a linear way to present in the information. So if you're using things that are highly visual, it needs to be interpretable as text. You have a good example of that is a progress bar. You know, you're at 62% of the process, or you're at 75% of the process. That's fine, but you should be able to indicate it in text as well, because not everybody is going to be able to parse that information that your progress bar is at half or 3/4 or whatnot. And then that text information should also be interpretable as text by assistive technology. One of the big issues I find, and I think a lot of accessibility experts come across, is problems with focus management. It's very important for keyboard users. When you're using the keyboard to navigate a page, it's really important that you get good focus, but it's also very important for screen reader users. For example, you're submitting a form and there's error in the form, and after you've submitted the form, the page loads and sighted users will see a big red warning saying, you didn't write your name properly, bozo. And that's good. That's useful for someone who's sighted. But if the focus has not been placed on the error message, chances are the screen reader user is not going to receive that information. So it's not as easy for them. So focus management is certainly a mission-critical aspect of building pages, and we can use JavaScript for that. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with keyboard navigation, it's actually fairly straightforward, and I urge you, I don't invite you, I urge you to try it. Try it on your favorite website, try it on the applications you're working on, try it on what you're building. Just use keyboard navigation, and that's really a first step to doing accessibility testing that doesn't cost you anything and doesn't really take you a lot of time. And to do that, you use the tab key to go from one focusable element to another. You use the shift tab key to move backwards. Unless you're using Safari on OS X at that moment, you use Option tab and Option shift tab. You would hit Enter or the space bar to activate an element that can be activated, whether it's a link, a button, or maybe even a pseudo link if it's been coded properly. We're talking about focusable elements. What are those? Well, typically we're talking about links, we're talking about buttons. We're also talking about form elements, whether it's input field, a select, a radio button. So these will naturally receive focus. We're talking about also iframes and a whole bunch of other elements that natively will receive focus. And somebody actually built a really good list of all elements that are focusable and in which browsers as well. So if you're interested, that's a good place to go check it out. But with some magic, we can also make elements that don't normally receive focus into focusable things. And to do that, we would use the tabindex attribute of the element. So we use either tabindex equals 0 or tabindex equals -1. What's the difference, you'll say? Well, I'll tell you. The tabindex 0 allows you to bring focus for people using the keyboard. So, if someone uses tab or shift tab to go through the elements, and you declare an element as having tabindex equals 0, then they'll be able to reach that element. Tabindex -1 is to allow for programmatic focus. So maybe you want to make sure that an error message will receive focus after an error has been detected, but you don't want it as part of the tab order. So you would use tabindex equals -1. This is very, very useful in improving the usability and the accessibility of some applications. However, be careful. Positive tab indexes, they are really a bad idea. We often encounter people that think, hey, I can determine the tab order of things. I can say to the user, I want this element to go first and then this one second and all that. But in reality, when you try to force a tab order, you can really cause nasty surprise for keyboard users. I would say don't ever use positive tab index. It's something that you should just take away from your vocabulary entirely, and everybody's going to be much happier. I remember working on a site, and I think Scott may remember that, but we found on a fairly major site, we found tabindex equals 4,356 or something like that, and just, you know, you would hope that a poor user would not have to tab through 4,000 links. It's just something you don't want to do. Anyway, stop beating a dead horse. One of the big issues with accessibility is modal windows. You pop some information up, or whether it's the login prompt or it's extra information about a feature of the service, or you were trying to sell extra information, and these modal windows are actually very tricky to make accessible. You don't want them to appear in normal tab order, because then that would kind of defeat the purpose of having them there. You want to make sure that it captures the keyboard until the window is closed. You want to make sure that the focus is set on heading, so when the modal window opens, then the screen reader user actually know what this window is about. And you should be able to close that window with the escape key or with the close button, you know, typically the X at the top right of the screen. I won't go into details on how to do that, but I did create a code pen that shows how you can make that happen using a bit of JavaScript and CSS. So, pardon. I invite you to check it out at bit.ly/accessible-modal. It's a, you know, obviously it's pretty bare bones, but it's going to give you an idea as to how you can implement that, and it's using the tab index in order to make that modal window accessible. So one of the big things about JavaScript is we're listening to events quite a bit, and we have event handlers. Now, event handlers can be either device dependent, and we're talking about an event handler that will listen for an action from the mouse or the keyboard, whether it's a key press or a click or whatnot. And we're also talking about device independent, so events that work for a mouse and a keyboard, and by other means as well. So in general, try to implement device independent event handlers, because you don't know how people are going to be using your site. If it's not possible, then at that point you use mouse and keyboard handlers that do the same thing. You pair them to make sure that that they work. So we're talking about event pairing. So if there's something that has to happen on mouse down, you make sure that it happens also on key down. That's pretty straightforward. I'm not gonna go more like that, but think about that. If you can't use a device independent event handler, try to double up and make sure that both are happening, whether it's keyboard or mouse. Now, when you're doing that, when you're talking about looking at how something happens with the mouse and how something happens with the keyboard, you shouldn't necessarily try to replicate the same action of what happens. So don't try to replicate exactly the mouse click or the keyboard press. Think about what the purpose of what you're doing in terms of what do we want to achieve rather than how we're achieving that. So it's okay if what happens with the keyboard is slightly different from what happens with the mouse, as long as the end goal is reachable. One of the things we have to think about is trying to avoid modifying default behaviors, whether it's event or HTML, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. But it's generally a bad idea to try to make something do something it wasn't designed for. Make sure you use events and elements the way they were designed to. So, event listener, we're talking about mouse over, about mouse out. Mouse over is obviously if the mouse cursor goes over an item. It's not an action if it's something merely decorative, although we don't see that very much anymore. Some of you may remember the use and abuse of mouse over. They would create a trail of stars following the mouse cursor's movement. That was really annoying. It also was not very accessible because, well, obviously screen reader users wouldn't see it, but also people with ADHD would go spare trying to interact with a website when there was all this activity going on that was distracting. So annoying for most of us, but could be quite a barrier. We often use mouse over for tooltips or for expanding navigation menus. We would use additional information for screen reader through alt text, ARIA label, or ARIA described by. But for keyboard users, what do we do about that? So we would look at event listener like focus or blur. Focus is when the cursor lands on an element, typically a form. Blur is when the cursor leaves that element. It's really a good match to pair with mouse over and mouse out. It's quite device independent because it can be used with mouse, with keyboard, or other assistive technology like drag and dictate, for example. One thing to keep in mind when you're talking about blur is don't automatically move the focus away to another element when you're using blur, or don't dynamically expose new form elements, or don't trap the user within a form using that because it's very, very distracting. You should only move the focus when the user actually asks to move focus. You should only load new content when the user asks to load new content, unless it's a warning that you know, oh my God, your computer's about to explode in your face. You really should shut down now, right away. Of course, that doesn't happen, but you never know. Talking about some more event listeners, click and double click. I'll say first about the double click, there's no keyboard equivalent to that. And really on the web, there's no real need to use that I can think of. Now, maybe somebody here will prove me right and tell me, oh yeah, I'm using double click in this fashion and it's really important, but you know, generally just avoid using it. The click event is normally triggered when a mouse is pressed over an HTML element. It's really intended to be device dependent. However, if the on-click is used on a keyboard navigable element, say a link or a form element, the enter key will typically work on those as if it was a mouse click. It will not, however, work on a div. So if you set a click event on a div, you will not be able to activate that with the keyboard, which is a problem. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a moment. So we're talking about dynamic content. Now, can you trigger the content with keyboard, and is the content accessible? Those are two questions you should ask yourself. In and of itself, creating content with something like document write, there's no intrinsic accessibility problem there. But what you create might be problematic, so make sure your content is accessible. It can be a problem if the content changes or refreshes quickly, or if the focus on that content is not being refreshed. So we need to make sure that we manage focus, as I spoke earlier, and that we generate the content on user requests. So a user clicks a button or activates a button rather than automatic generation. And I'll talk a little bit about one way to notify screen reader users of content change in a little bit. I've spoken about a few things that you need to think about. Obviously, it's not an in-depth JavaScript accessibility course, but for developers, it's a good little intro to prompt your thinking. But one of the things I haven't discussed very much is why ARIA. ARIA is not really technically JavaScript, but you use it hand in hand with JavaScript to make your life easier and to improve accessibility. So I think it's important to mention a few things about it. What is ARIA? We're talking about accessible, rich internet applications. Basically, it's a technical spec that the W3C provided to increase the accessibility on the web, especially with dynamic content and user interfaces. I suspect the people listening to this today are familiar with it, but maybe some of the people that will watch the video later on aren't, and I really urge you to read on it. However, we must all remember the first rule of ARIA is don't use ARIA unless it's necessary. ARIA was really intended to improve things, but we have a whole range of HTML tools that actually are pretty damn good, and we should rely on semantic HTML first and foremost. And then you use ARIA to make things more polished, better, easier to use. And so what do I mean when I'm talking about semantics? Well, a good example of that is buttons. Buttons are a clickable element that trigger an action. A div, well, it's a div, it's a container. And with ARIA and JavaScript, you can actually make a div behave like a button. But why would you change the default behavior? What possible need is there to really make that happen when you have perfectly good, valid, easy-to-use semantic element that assistive technology will be able to parse and announce as being it's a button, and we want to understand what a button does? Well, assistive technology knows how to do that and knows what to do with it. And if you try to change the behavior, for example, saying that this div is now a button, assistive technology may not be able to actually make it behave the way you want unless you've thought about every single instance of what could go wrong with it. We're talking about screen readers, we're talking about keyboard users, and I've put up a couple examples of button versus divs again on CodePen at bit.ly/button-div. And if you want to have fun and see what the differences are, it's a bit of fun. Right, so ARIA has roles and properties and states and stuff. The ARIA roles, well, we can say it has a role of search, a role of tooltip, alerts, and we can apply that to different things. You can, for example, define that a search form is actually a search form and define that role in the code of your form, and that will provide further information for assistive technologies. If you're using a div for tooltip, well, it will actually impart that information. There's so many roles I can't actually talk to you about all them roles, but there's a lot of tools available there that can be good. But remember, don't use ARIA roles to make something behave in a way that isn't supposed to be. For example, you can't say div role equals button. Well, you can, but you shouldn't. And I'm talking about that a lot because it's something we see so often. It's so important to avoid that. In terms of properties and states, we're talking about things that define a little bit more an element. So you can talk about an input form being required. So you can define it as ARIA requires equal through. And then Assistive Technologies will know about the fact that this field is required. You can label an input. So say you have a regular HTML label for name, and your input is name, and you detect that the person has made an error in their name, and you trigger an error message. You can add the area labeled by. So at that moment, the Assistive Technologies will know to associate the error message with the label. You can have using expanded and hidden attributes to hide and show areas of pages. And when you're describing, when you're talking about dynamic content, things that change on the page, you can use the ARIA Live attribute to notify a screen reader user that something has changed in the page. And that's really talking about live regions. There's three states to live regions. The first one is ARIA Live equals off, and that means that there's no notification that's going to be sent to a screen reader user. And that, except for some case edges, it's not really a good way to approach things. So I would avoid using that. The most often used notification is ARIA Live polite. So it will announce to the screen reader user that something changed on a page once a task has been completed, whether it's the reading of a paragraph or tabbing from one place to another or these kind of things. So that's probably the best approach. And then, of course, you would have an attribute that actually interrupts the current tasks and notify the user. This can be important if they're about to run out of time. Excuse me a second. Sorry about that. So yeah, ARIA assertive interrupts the tasks, and it's a good use for warnings, running out of time, or other things that go wrong that need somebody's immediate attention. Say, for example, you're selling a product and you have a little script in the background that sees if the price changed between the time they started ordering and the time they actually went ahead and placed the order. You might want to tell them, hey, you're about to spend $10 more than you were expecting on that, or whatever. So that's really the quick overview of some of the things that we're talking about when we're talking about JavaScript and accessibility. Obviously, if you are an accessibility expert, that might have been pretty basic, but I think if you're the developer that is aware that there's accessibility out there, but you're not too sure how or what, that might have been helpful. Anyway, I invite questions, and I will stop screen sharing so we can have a discussion here. So there we go. Hopefully that was interesting for you people, and there's a discussion that we can go on from now.
Thanks, Nicolas, for your presentation. Definitely opening up discussion, any questions. And again, a reminder that we'll be posting this presentation to the YouTube channel after it is completed. So if we could get any links from your presentation, also
Yep.
there, that we can cross post those as well. All right, so everyone needs to not be so shy this morning. I know it's a little bit earlier than we normally have this discussion, so people might still be in different time zones waking up. But yeah, I think that's pretty awesome. Oh, okay.
I do like Jim's question of, seriously, how did you break both thumbs?
Nice.
Well, that was really clever of me. It didn't happen at the same time. The first one was encountering a patch of ice on the sidewalk, and my front casters got stuck, and I jumped out of the wheelchair and I landed on my thumb, and it went backwards, and that was really unpleasant. And after I was in cast with one hand and in cast, my wife was finding it amusing because she said, "Oh, now you're going to go around in circles in your wheelchair," which was not helpful, but that's another story. And the other thumb I broke because I was driving and holding the steering wheel of the car, and as I was turning around a corner, someone drove through a red light and hit my car right in the wheels that were actually at an angle. So they forcefully pushed the wheel straight, which forcefully turned the steering wheel and caught my thumb and twisted it back.
Oh, that sounds so painful. Sorry.
That was painful, and it was between the two casts nearly 6 months. One of the casts was on for 5 months, so it was yeah.
So how did you navigate during that time when you had both hands disabled on it? Did you keyboard tab, or did you use
I pretty much used the keyboard using tab, shift tab, but again with modifiers, so I used sticky keys. And I started using drag and dictate to interact with the computers a lot, and I discovered that drag and dictate for the Mac is actually nowhere near as good as drag and dictate for Windows, unfortunately.
Oh, that's interesting. You would think that the same product would be very similar for both iOSs, but not the case.
Yeah, you would think. And what's even more interesting is that my dad, when he learned about me using drag and dictate, he thought, oh, well, maybe that will allow me to dictate and write my text faster. And he got himself drag and dictate for the Mac in French, and that was just a pure waste of money.
That's unfortunate for sure. I know that you also mentioned that sometimes those speech to text they're hard with accents or people English as a second language maybe.
Yeah, speech to text is tricky, and there's really two major types of speech to text things. One is pretty much drag and dictate is, as far as I know, the only real application out there, which is really powerful because it allows you to train the application for your own speech patterns and for your own words. And I've actually worked with a church minister using drag and dictate. They had several deaf and hard of hearing parishioners, and they were not able to benefit from service, and the church was not able to afford sign language interpreter. So we actually worked with the church in getting a affordable overhead projector and a laptop, and the priest trained drag and dictate, and he was able to speak his sermons and have that projected directly onto a screen. So that was beneficial for the 5 people that identified as deaf or hard of hearing. And then they realized that all the elderly parishioners that didn't really identify as hard of hearing, but who didn't hear all that well, actually benefited from being able to see in large font displayed what the priest was saying. And then after a few weeks, the priest discovered that he had access to all his sermons indexed in text, and he was able to refer to that. So it was a big win. However, I digress about the fun of speech to text. The other speech to text applications we're pretty much all familiar with is Siri or Android equivalent on your phones, and those you can't specifically train, and you can have some hilarious results, albeit some frustrating results as well sometimes when you have an accent or English is not your first language, or like my wife is a New Zealander and she's been here for 3 years, so she's losing her Kiwi accent, but she doesn't have a really North American accent yet. So if she sets Siri to North America, Siri doesn't understand her, and if she sets Siri to Australia and New Zealand, Siri doesn't understand her anymore. So there can be problems, but by and large, they are fantastic tools, and as time goes on, it's getting more and more powerful.
Yeah, I realize we kind of got off the topic of JavaScript specifically, but I think these are really great examples of temporary disabilities or situational disabilities, or places where you can see accessibility helping people who maybe aren't saying that they're disabled also, like you're talking about the priest and the people reading the words who maybe could hear, but it would be helpful to also see the words. So I think these are really wonderful real life examples, and unfortunately, you became one with your double thumb issue, but hopefully that won't happen again. All right. I don't see... Oh, we have one more question here from Mark W. It says, are there any user interface component libraries that are documented being WCAG 2.0 conformant? Compliant, maybe?
As far as I know, there's nothing that is specifically documented as being WCAG conformant, but somebody else may be aware of something. I'm not doing all that much work with interface components. I do know that you can make some magic happens with React, but I don't know if they're specifically documented as being WCAG conformant. So maybe somebody else that's in the audience actually knows a little bit more about that. Maybe Scott, do you know anything about it?
I was going to say not an entire library, but perhaps, like you mentioned, there's React components, and there's a lot of folks who are doing a lot of work with React and creating specific components that you can sort of bring into your project to start using. But as far as an entire library, I'm not sure. I think there's a lot of, pattern libraries out there that feature a lot of really great stuff, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I would actually really recommend any one specific. There's a lot of good stuff out there, but I haven't really tried it out myself or tested it. So,
Thanks. That pretty much echoes what I thought.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we can repost some of these questions that I'm seeing in the chat and hearing in the Slack channels onto Twitter or other social media. And then we can get some more information for you, or if it doesn't exist, or we can make it, right? We can build it. So
in our spare time.
Yeah, exactly, in our spare time. But yeah, I thank you very much for coming and presenting to the group today. I know a lot of people watch this after the fact as well, so hopefully we can get some chatter after the fact. Just letting you know that next month we're also going to be hosting another event. Instead of one guest, we're going to have 3 guests, Eric Bailey, Scott O'Hara, and Scott Winkle. Hopefully I said your last name correctly. But we're going to chat about how we got our start in accessibility and how to stay connected to the community and how we grow in that way. So it kind of gives you an idea of maybe where they've come from and how they're staying connected still. If there's anybody who's got topics or ideas or speaker ideas also for the future, let me know. Just do the hashtag #A11yTalks and we can figure something out. But I hope you all could join us in November, and thank you for joining us this month.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.